I have my technical support in the background coming and telling me that I've got my microphone all wrong. I'm really appreciative for the help. Again, welcome. I'm so excited to be here this evening. I'm having technical problems galore today. I've decided that I wanted to do this podcast as a live session. I'm hoping that some people will be able to join us today and we can have a chat about the topic that we're going to be discussing. In the meantime, as I've been setting this all up, the background filter on my webcam isn't working properly, which is why I've not got background removal today. And I've just had a few technical problems being able to get the stream up and live. So I do apologise for that. But in the meantime, thank you very much. 21st Century Saints, great to have you here. Thank you very much for popping on and saying hello. I'm trying to experiment today. I'm trying with the podcast different formats and different fields. And what I want to do is have a little bit of a live session today. So hopefully we can have a little bit of audience and we can have a little bit of a chat. I think that it's always interesting to have input from other people. What do I want to talk about today then? So this week's Come Follow Me lesson, which is carefully hidden behind my lack of transparency there, is actually we're looking at episode 3 or lesson 3 of the Come Follow Me manual, which is called I Saw a Pillar of Light and focuses on Joseph Smith history, chapter 1, verses 1 through 26. Essentially, this week's lesson is covering and looking at the first vision. Now, if you're a member of the church, if you're an ex-member of the church, if you understand the church and the way that the dynamics of that, what you will appreciate is the first vision, and therefore what we want to talk about today is very much foundational and the cornerstone of very much of that LDS faith. Joe, if the first vision, if you like, is the part of the story that starts it all. And so what I want to dig in today is have a look at that first vision, and we're going to have a look at some of the stories that go around that and some of the information that we have about what happened or lack of information we have about what happened. And we're going to explore today that first vision and see whether it stands up to scrutiny. And again, in the comments, I'm really interested to see your thoughts and your opinions on this. The first vision is really interesting from a faithful, non-faithful perspective. It is one of those areas that we look at as a real challenge point for the narrative and the truth claims of the church. But there's a lot of nuance in this story and a lot of things to be investigated. And I think that we need to just take a step back and have a look at it. You'll see what I mean as we go. Okay. So first of all then, the first vision. If you're not a member of the church, if you're a never-mo, if you've not been around the church at all, and the first vision isn't familiar to you, the story goes basically like this. So Joseph Smith was a young lad who lived in upstate New York. He lived in a little town called Palmyra, just up towards the Great Lakes, not quite there, up from New York in New York State. And he lived there in the 1820s, 1810s, 1820s. And his family had moved there and they were farmers. He was a itinerant farmer. He was a labourer as a profession as a young boy with his family. Around that area in upstate New York at the time, it coincided with something called the Second Great Awakening. The area of New York and those surrounding counties is often referred to as the burned over district. And what was happening in New York at that time was that a lot of religious people, preachers, faiths, churches, and the wide spectrum, there was a lot of interest in them. There were a lot of preachers who were traveling around or coming to town who were talking about God and talking about faith and looking to convert people to their own versions of Christianity. And it was an area where there was a lot of religious upheaval interest. And that's a documented fact. We can go back and we find evidence of that Great Awakening and those things at the time in that area. So in this area of religious upheaval, we have this young lad, Joseph Smith. He claims in 1820, he was 14 years old, that he was taken up with all this religious fervour, and he wanted to know what he should do in his life to be able to understand in terms of faith and what church to join. So this young man took himself into the woods and found a quiet grove of trees and got down on his knees to pray. And he prayed to God to find out what God would want of him and what church he should join. In the official account, he talks about a blackness and a darkness overcoming him, as though he was being attacked by some kind of evil force, to the point where he felt that he would die. And just as he was about to succumb to that, as he describes it, there is a brightness in the sky, and he looks up, and he has a theophany, a vision, and he sees, as he describes it, he sees God the Father, and he sees the Son Jesus Christ as two physical beings who came and visited him and talked to him, assured him his sins were forgiven, and told him that none of the churches as they were God's church as he wanted it, and that Joseph would then go on to become a prophet and restore the gospel at that time. And that essentially is the shortened version of the first vision. It's cornerstone critical to the LDS Church, because this is the story that starts the whole thing off, that Joseph is called to be a prophet, and he is then going to go on and do the things that he claimed in terms of finding the Book of Mormon, translating the Book of Mormon, restoring the church, and all the doctrines that exist. So this is essentially the first vision story. If we go to if we go to the Come Follow Me manual and we look at the key messages the church have there, it's interesting. I spent quite a lot of time looking at the Come Follow Me manuals. What we seem to have this year is the church drilling back to about 3 or 4 very simple key points for each of the lessons that are there. And the first point, and assuming that the first vision happened as Joseph described, one naturally follows the other, is the idea that Joseph Smith saw God and was the prophet of the restoration. He would then restore the gospel and establish the church. So that's learning point 1 from the lesson manual. Second point is that Joseph Smith went and prayed, and he received an answer to prayer. And the second learning point from the manual, I guess, is that we also, if Joseph was able to go and pray, he's setting an example to us, and that we can go and receive answers to prayers as well, and we can get information for ourselves. Again, in the first of the podcast I did after the prologue, I focused on that scripture, James 1, 5 and 6. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally, upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. And this is the scripture that prompts Joseph to go and pray and receive this first vision. But it's actually really important, because if Joseph really did do that and received answers to prayers, what he's saying to us is that we can do the same thing, and we can go get answers to prayers as well. And we're as entitled to get an answer to prayer as Joseph was, and anybody else is, as the prophet today is. And therefore we have that ability to rely on our own revelation, if you like, and not just go based around what someone else tells us we should be doing. So we have the second concept coming through, that we can receive answers to prayers. Quite an important concept, really. Thirdly, from a theological standpoint, we learn something about the nature of God. And Joseph is teaching that he saw God the Father and Jesus Christ. He saw two physical beings. And therefore, that goes against the mainstream Christianity of the time, over the ages, that God is a spirit, and that Jesus and the Father are one combined. It sets outside of the traditional Christian theology exists at the time. But the fact that Joseph Smith saw God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ is really important. And there's impact to that, and we're going to look into that a little bit further in terms of what that actually looks like and what that implies for this story. And then Joseph obviously claimed that he was going to be persecuted for his sins. He claimed he told people about his experience, and that he was persecuted for that. And the fourth learning point, therefore, is we can help follow from that example. And even if we are rejected for our beliefs, we can remain true. And that essentially is the Come Follow Me lesson for this week, as taught at church along the way. Except for one part, actually. For the first time ever, and I've got my slides in a different order. So I'm going to jump forward a couple of slides, and then we're going to go back one. Okay. For the first time ever in LDS Sunday school manuals, they even reference the fact there are multiple accounts of the first vision. That's huge. Okay. Right up until the last iteration of Sunday school manuals, the 2021 Come Follow Me for Doctrine and Covenants, the idea that there were multiple accounts of the first vision are not even mentioned. We have for the first time Come Follow Me manuals that are actually acknowledging the fact there are multiple accounts of the first vision. What they say is that during his life, Joseph Smith recorded the experience in the sacred grove at least 4 times, often using a scribe. And the church says, in addition, several accounts were written by other people who heard Joseph talk about his vision. And this is the key point. Although these accounts differ in some details, depending on the author, audience and settings, they are otherwise consistent. And each account adds details that help us better understand Joseph's experience, just as each of the 4 New Testament Gospels helps us better understand the Saviour's ministry. So we've got a key point that they're teaching in the current Come Follow Me is acknowledgement of 4 different versions of the account, but turning around and suggesting that they are fairly internally consistent. And we're going to have a look into that in a second. Okay, going back the slide. Couple of quotes that I just wanted to bring in here. So, President Oakes, the first vision is the pivotal event in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is the foundation of our faith, the beginning of modern revelation, and the evidence of God's love for his children in restoring the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then a few years back in 2002, President Hinckley made quite a very bold statement about this first vision. He said, "Our whole strength rests on the validity of that vision. It either occurred or it did not occur. If it did not, then this work is a fraud. If it did, then it is the most important and wonderful work under the heavens. Talk about nailing your colours to the mast. If this event happened, this is the greatest work of all time. If it didn't, it is a fraud." We need to think about this. So let's have a bit of a drill in. Okay. I noticed that we got a couple of people in the chat there. I'd be interested if you've got any thoughts about what we're talking about and the vision there. I'd be really interested if you to chuck them into the conversation and join in and tell me your thoughts as well. Excuse me. But what I want to do is look at the different accounts that are there. So on the screen now, we're looking at the 1832 account. The image on the left that's kind of behind me, that actually is a screen grab of the actual document, as if you go to the Joseph Smith Papers Project. This is the document the 1832 account is written on. It's an image of that. So what happened in 1832 that was specific? Okay, in 1832, Joseph has started to write a diary, and he's starting to write a history of the experience he's had. If you actually go to, and I'd encourage you to do it, go to the Joseph Smith Papers Project, just search the 1832 account and have a look. Have a look at the full document here. It's quite interesting, actually, but it starts off with, in Joseph's handwriting, him talking about, quite badly written actually, that he is trying to account the experiences that he's had, to write them down and record them. And the first vision bit is written in his own hand, but not long after that the handwriting changes, and Joseph, we know, used scribes along the way, and we actually see that move to a scribe as opposed to Joseph. But this is written in Joseph's own hand. Okay, I pulled the text across directly, so where it looks a bit strange in the text on the right, that's because I literally have copied and pasted so we can see what was actually said rather than trying to make any amendments or editorial to it. And this is what the 1832 says. It says, "Therefore I cried unto the Lord for mercy, for there was none else to whom I could go and to obtain mercy. And the Lord heard my cry in the wilderness. And while in the attitude of calling upon the Lord, in the 16th year of my age, a pillar of firelight above with the brightness of sun at noonday came down from above and rested upon me, and I was filled with the Spirit of God, and the Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord And he spake unto me, saying, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven me. Go thy way, walk in my statutes, and keep my commandments. Behold, I am the Lord of glory. I was crucified in the world, that all those who believe on my name may have eternal life. Behold, the world lieth in sin, and at this time, and none doeth good, no, not one, that they have turned aside from the gospel, and keep my commandments. They draw near to me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and my anger is kindling against the inhabitants of the earth, to visit them according to their ungodliness, and to bring to pass that which hath been spoken by the mouth of the prophets and apostles. Behold, and lo, I come quickly, as it is written of me in the cloud, clothed in the glory of my Father. And my soul was filled with love, and for many days I could rejoice with great joy. And the Lord was with me, but could find none that would believe the heavenly vision. Nevertheless, I pondered these things in my heart. That is Joseph's 1832 account of the first vision. A lot of us have heard it mentioned. I don't think everyone's actually looked at it as much as looked at some of the comments that are made about it. But there's a couple of key points that we really, really need to pull out. Okay? The official narrative that we have says Joseph 14. He now says in the 16th year of his age. Okay? The official narrative says that he saw two beings, but in this version of the account, he saw one. We see him referred to as Lord, and the way that the Lord describes himself implies that this is probably Jesus Christ, but he's not named. Okay, and the purpose of this vision is to go and understand how he stands with God and seek a forgiveness of his sins. And he is given that. He is also told that God isn't happy with any other churches that exist, but that is the limit of the information that is given. So that's the 1832 account. Okay, let's jump on then. So the next direct first-hand account that we have, if you like, was recorded in 1835. Okay, now again, for context, where does the account come from? Again, behind me, the text there again is a screen grab from the Joseph Smith Papers project of the actual document this is recorded on. Okay, and in this instance, we have an accounting. We have a diary being kept by one of his scribes that is actually, again, it's quite interesting. This is actually a day or 2 days entries in his diary, and you can see him talking about visiting one of the sisters prior in the morning of it, and various other things happening around. But in 1835, a person who is described as a Jewish minister came to meet with Joseph Smith and asked him about what happened, and was asking him about the beliefs and where his church came from. And what we're seeing here is Joseph's answer to Joshua the minister, what he told him, being written down by a scribe and being recorded. I commenced giving him a revelation of the circumstances connected with the coming forth of the Book of Mormon as follows. He says, being wrought up in my mind respecting the subject of religion, and looking upon at the different systems taught the children of men, I knew not who was right or wrong, or who was wrong, and considered it of the first importance that I should be right in matters that involved eternal consequences. Being thus perplexed in mind, I retired to the silent grove and bowed down before the Lord, under a realizing sense that he had not said, if the Bible be true, asking ye shall receive, knock and it shall be opened, seek and you shall find, and again, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally upbraideth not. Information was what I most desired at this time, and with a fixed determination to obtain it, I called upon the Lord for the first time in the place above stated, or in other words, I made a fruitless attempt to pray. My tongue seemed to be swollen in my mouth so that I could not utter. I heard a noise behind me like some person walking towards me. I strove again to pray, but could not. The noise of walking seemed to draw nearer. I sprung up to my feet and looked around. Saw no person or thing that was calculated to produce the noise of walking. I kneeled again, my mouth was opened and my tongue liberated, and I called on the Lord in mighty prayer. A pillar of fire appeared above my head and rested down upon me. my head, and filled me with joy unspeakable. A personage appeared in the midst of this pillar of flame, which was spread all around, and yet nothing consumed. Another personage soon appeared like unto the first. He said unto me, Thy sins are forgiven thee. He testified unto me, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And I saw many angels in this vision. I was about 14 years old when I received this first communication. Stuff's changed. The narrative has changed very slightly. We're seeing some different information. First of all, we now have to go to a grove of trees to pray, and we have the first reference of that specific James 1:5-6 scripture alluded to there. But actually, there's some more important things here. We have now the idea of, as he gets down to pray, him struggling to do so, and something oppressive happening, as he talks about later on. In this instance, he doesn't name the people who visited him. We now have gone from 1 to 2, so he had a personage appeared and a second personage appeared. All right. Those personages testified that Jesus is the Son of God, but he doesn't cite who they are. And then he goes on to say he saw many angels in this vision, which at least could be seen to imply he saw angels, not the Father and the Son themselves. Incidentally, we've now moved from being 16 in his 16th year to being 14. So we have a change in that narrative in that direction. It's interesting how these two stories don't totally line up with each other, although there are similarities that are there. 1838 account. I'm not going to go and put Joseph Smith History 1 through 26 on the screen. If you're not familiar with the story, go and read it. It's interesting. Okay, and it's foundational to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and who they are and what they believe and what the church is as an organisation. But I've talked about the 1838 account already. Key points of 1838 account, though, are now this account becomes the documented official history of the church. It is recorded in Scripture. It's recorded in the Pearl of Great Price, and as Joseph Smith History, chapter 1. And it tells the story of the official interpretation of what happened. We now move to him going to pray. We have a much stronger narrative on a dark spirit trying to stop him. We now, for the first time, have the Father and the Son named in this story, and the idea of the Father turning around saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him," and effectively handing across to Jesus, who then tells him that none of the churches were his, and that he shouldn't join any of those churches, and that he would establish his own church later on. Okay, so we have a much more detailed account, which includes information that does contradict or is not supported by previous versions. 1842. The final account I want to look at. Now, in this account, this is part of something called the Wentworth letter. If you're not familiar with what the Wentworth letter is, and you have an LDS history, I'll just say the Articles of Faith. We know the Articles of Faith were written in a letter to someone to tell them what the core doctrines of the church was. That was the Wentworth letter. If you look at the Wentworth letter, there are 3 or 4 parts, but it includes an account of the first vision. It includes the Articles of Faith that start to outline what the church teaches. So in this 1842 account, it says, "Believe in the word of God. I had confidence in the declaration of James. If any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. I retired to a secret place in a grove and began to call upon the Lord. While fervently engaged in supplication, my mind was taken away from the objects with which I was surrounded, and I was enwrapped in a heavenly vision and saw 2 glorious personages who exactly resembled each other in features and likeness, surrounded with a brilliant light which eclipsed the sun at noonday. They told me that all the religious denominations were believing in incorrect doctrines, and that none of them was acknowledged as God as his church and kingdom.
and I was expressly commissioned to not go after them, at the same time receiving a promise that the fullness of the gospel should at some time, future time, be made known unto me. Interesting. Okay, we see a much shortened, condensed version of that 1838 official account. But what is interesting is, even in this 1842 account, he doesn't actually name who he saw. It's only really that 1838 account that says that he saw the Father and the Son. And the 1835 suggested he saw Jesus. So we have these four accounts. And I felt it was really important to look at these accounts and look what that was actually in them and see what those are going to be. Just to summarise that up then, in terms of those first vision accounts, we've got a few things there. 1832 account focuses on personal forgiveness of sins, and it mentions only Jesus Christ, not the Father. Okay, he only saw Jesus. 1835, it introduces angels and dramatic opposition from darkness, but it does lack the focus for the church of the 1838 account. The 1842 account simplifies the story for a broader non-LDS audience. Okay, these variations across these accounts do raise questions about consistency. Critics often argue that later accounts reflect theological developments rather than the original experience, while members see them as complementary insights to a profound event. What do you think? What's your opinion? What are you seeing? What is really interesting is to look at how leaders of the church have dealt with these multiple events over the years. Joseph Fielding Smith, who was president of the church in the mid-20th century, suppressed it. Joseph Fielding Smith restricted access to earlier first vision accounts, such as the 1832 version. He restricted access to going to Joseph's diary, that we've seen the screenshot of today, ripping the page of this account out and locking it away in a vault so that no one could see it and knew that it was there. It was only when it became clear that people knew this account existed anyway that he kind of said, okay then, went and found it and put it back. A prophet of the church felt it important enough to redact, hide and suppress these other versions of the first vision. Okay, what does that mean? Critics suggest that this was an attempt to suppress discrepancies, while faithful members see this as a view as protecting sacred experiences. And that is a quote from Givens in his book, Wrestling the Angel. Again, I said at the outset, it tends to be one of the sticks to beat the church with, and it's a little bit more nuanced because we've got this. Critics use this attempt to suppress discrepancies. Faithful members see it as protecting sacred experiences. Critics see the differences. Faithful members of the church see the similarities. And both are able to use that in some way to reinforce their position. Be interested to know in the chat, if you like, just tell me what your thoughts are. Where do you sit as you look at this? How does it make you feel as you see these different accounts? What effect does that have on you? Okay, but yeah, it does have this interesting dichotomy. What is interesting though is if we bring some other information as well. Okay, and this is something again that we looked at in the first episode that I did, and this was talking about the timeline. And one of the interesting aspects of the timeline is something called the Lectures on Faith. I've talked about the Lectures on Faith before. Essentially, when the church was in Kirtland, Joseph taught a series of lessons that he called the Lectures on Faith. This was, we learned that Joseph, and we often talk about this in a prelude to Sunday school, is Joseph would get the brethren of the church together and they would sit upstairs in the temple in Kirtland, and he would teach them and he would lecture them. It was called the School of the Prophets, and the Lectures of Faith were the things that he would taught. In fact, the School of the Prophets and Lectures on Faith, this is where the story of the brethren the elders in the church chewing tobacco, spitting the tobacco all over the floor, Emma complaining about that, and that's then what leads us to receive that revelation, which is the word of wisdom. That'll be an interesting investigation when we get to that lesson later in the year. Okay, but the lectures on faith are what Joseph taught in the temple at that time. And one of the lectures on faith, Joseph teaches about the nature of God. And he taught that specifically that God the Father is a spirit, while Jesus Christ is a personage of tabernacle, i.e. he had a physical body. So he is teaching in circa 1834-35, Joseph is physically standing in front of the other elders of the church and saying, God the Father is a spirit, aligned with the kind of theology believed and taught by wider Christianity at that time and ongoing. Very much more Trinitarian. Okay? That lectures on faith is later removed from the Doctrine and Covenants because it doesn't match the theology the church has about the nature of God. But here's my question. Okay? If we accept the church's narrative, in 1820, Joseph saw the Father and the Son. One of the key facts of that vision, as I stated at the outset, is he learns about the nature of God. He learns that that God the Father is a physical being. And that's an important teaching point about the nature of God in today's Come Follow Me lesson specifically, and in the church's theology as a whole. So why, in 1834, 14 years later, is he teaching people that God is a Father of Spirit? I don't understand. There's a massive inconsistency here that needs to be recognised and needs to be discussed and needs to be considered. Okay, so we have theological concerns based around this first vision as well. So did it happen then? It's an interesting question. And I spent some time over the last couple of days discussing this with my wife. Did it actually happen? And there's a few things that we need to consider. First of all is core consistency, and this very much leans to the church's position. All accounts do agree on a few facts. They agree that Joseph Smith was seeking divine guidance in a time of religious confusion and received a divine visitation. This consistency supports the idea that a significant spiritual event experience occurred, even if the details vary. And then the church will argue that variances reflect natural human memory, emphasizing how the main themes remain intact across the accounts. Having looked closely at the four accounts, I do put a question mark against how the main themes remain intact. Certainly that there was a visitation, the concerns he had and his reasons for praying are similar, but who he saw changes, and that is one of the main themes. So, but the church will argue that variances reflect natural human memory, and that is why the accounts are different. On the other hand, there are key variations. We have differences in who appeared: God, Christ, angels, what their message was, what the event's purpose it was, and that can raise questions about the reliability of Joseph's memory, or whether the narrative evolved over time to fit changing priorities. Yeah? Early church teachings focused more on the Book of Mormon and the Priest of Restoration, actually. If you go back and look at the accounts around those early missionaries as they're going out and teaching, they don't go out and teach as our missionaries do today, and they knock on the door and say, I'd like to tell you about a guy called Joseph Smith who saw God and saw Jesus Christ, and they told him he would establish a church. That very much is the lead point normally for missionaries today, as they go out and they speak to the world and teach people about the church. At this time, it wasn't the lead point. The lead point was very much 1823. Joseph had a vision and he saw an angel who may have been called Moroni or may be called Nephi, depending who's recounting the account to you. And they very quickly into talk about a book of scripture that therefore shows that God is talking to the world again. Okay, and priesthood authority. The lead points of conversation about the foundation of the church in those early days was not this first vision. It was Book of Mormon. It was priesthood restoration. Even with the 1838 account, the lead point of the first vision doesn't really come in until the Pearl of Great Prize is canonized, and later in the late 1800s, and we see a shift in narrative there. Okay, the prominence of the first vision then in later narratives could indicate its retroactive importance in establishing LDS doctrine. And there's a credibility gap. Critics would argue that the discrepancies suggest fabrication or embellishment rather than authentic memory differences along the way. So there's a few thoughts along the way there as well. Brings us to a subject, something called flashbulb memory. Flashbulb memory is the idea that human memory for significant life events is a complex subject. With the idea of flashbulb memory, the idea is that if you witness a significant event that is life-changing, that can become almost like a photographic flash embedded in your memory. Okay? But when we study that memory over time, studies show that memory becomes less accurate as time passes. Even vivid memories, such as those described in those flashbulb memory studies, are prone to distortion as they're influenced by new information, opens and reinterpretations. So what effect does this have? Okay, and we see this in memories along the way, and it's something to consider in terms of our own memories and how we interpret our own memories information actually. And there were a lot of studies done actually on this after 9/11 and people's how they recounted and recalled what they witnessed at the time. You witness a major event. All of us can turn around and say, I remember where I was on the day man landed on the moon, the day JFK was shot, the day the Berlin Wall came down, the day that these are all major lifetime flashbulb points that become embedded in our minds. But what we find is that over the passage of time, our own opinions, thoughts, and narratives influence that. And what we perceive as an accurate recollection of an event changes. And it changes in a way that we, perhaps as the person remembering it, don't realise. And we believe we are internally consistent in our memories when the narrative is changing and we're now recalling something different to the event that actually happened. And this is a really important concept, this flashbulb memory. There's a lot of research being done into this and a lot of information around how that actually works. We'll go on to that slide in a second. What's the impact of this? Okay, if Joseph had a theophany, if he saw God, that would certainly be a massive event in his life that I would expect him to remember. Over time, we see the dialogue change. We see the message change, who he saw, what the message was. The age he was at when the event happened gets younger and is not internally consistent. And this would be consistent with the idea of a flashbulb memory of something happening in Joseph's life. And by the time he's coming to record those events later in his life, his recollection genuinely has changed, even though he believes he is recalling those events as happened. And that would be this flashbulb memory effect. Okay, so let's have a look at a few other aspects then. At least Joseph was the only person who had a vision, hey? Except that he wasn't. I've got a few slides here. We'll do these quickly. I'm not going to read every word on them. But I've got a few slides here of other first vision type accounts
from that same worldview and milieu that Joseph lived in at the time. We've got David Brainerd in 1812. His journal was published in 1812, including an account of his own theophany, in which he describes an encounter with God. His encounter is similar to Joseph Smith's, and then it took place in a grove after much spiritual distress. However, Brainerd doesn't describe God as being a personage of body as much as having a spiritual experience with a spiritual being. So you have David Brainerd. 1813, we have a guy called Benjamin Abbott. Okay, Benjamin Abbott published an account of the account was published in 1813. The account was of a vision that Reverend Benjamin Abbott claimed he had in 1772. His vision includes, and you can see, seeing the Father and Jesus Christ, as well as an pronouncement that his sins were forgiven. Very similar to what Joseph was claiming, actually. And if you look further in the documents that go back to this, he also recounts persecution he experienced as a result of sharing his vision experience. So that was Reverend Benjamin Abbott. A guy called Lorenzo Dow. When past the age of 13 years, I went out of doors and was taken up by a whirlwind. Lorenzo Dow was an eccentric American preacher, said to have preached to more people than any other preacher of his era. His compiled journal was published in 1814 and contained an account of his own heavenly theophany while a young teen boy. Norris Stearns. Now, Norris Stearns is a really, really interesting account. Norris Stearns, in 1815, published his own vision in Greenfield, Massachusetts, not that far from where the Smith family then lived in Vermont. The most intriguing aspect of Stearns' vision is how he described the Father and the Son as two separate, distinct human personages. The members of the church have long considered that that was one of the truths that had been lost from the world until that first vision. At length, as I lay apparently upon the brink of eternal woe, seeing but nothing but death before me, suddenly there came a sweet flow of the love of God to my soul, which gradually increased. At the same time, there appeared a small gleam of light in the room above the brightness of the sun, and then at his meridian, which grew brighter and brighter. As this light and love increased, my sins began to separate, and the mountain removed towards the east. At length, being in an ecstasy of joy, I turned to the other side of the bed, whether in the body or out I cannot tell, God knoweth. Therefore, there I saw two spirits, which I knew at the first sight. But if I had the tongue of an angel, I could not describe their glory, for they brought the joys of heaven with them. One was God, my Maker, almost in bodily shape like a man, his face as it were a flame of fire, and his body as it had been a pillar and a cloud. In looking steadfastly to discern features, I could see none, but a small glimpse would appear in some other place. Below him stood Jesus Christ, my Redeemer, in perfect shape like a man. His face was not ablaze, but had the countenance of fire, being bright and shining. His Father's will appeared to be his. All was condescension, peace, and love. If I would put that against the Joseph Smith first vision account and not give context, it would be easy to assume that this was a first vision account from Joseph. It's interesting how similar they are. Again, we have Elias Smith, 1816, a minister by the name of Elias Smith, published a book in which he told of his conversion. There are various features in Elias's story. He went out into the woods. He talked about a light appearing to shine from heaven. His mind seemed to rise in that light to the throne of God and the Lamb. The Lamb once slain appeared to my understanding, and while viewing him, I felt such love to him as I never felt to anything earthly. He wasn't able to tell how long I remained in that situation. Again, we have massive similarity between Elias's and Joseph's account. Asa Wilde in 1823. Again, an interesting account there. The Lord in his boundless goodness was pleased to communicate the following revelation revelation, having in the first place presented me the very glorious vision, in which I saw the same things. Okay, again, he talks about seeing the Father. He talks about his religious experience and along the way. And then Billy Hibbard finally. When I came to the place of prayer, had kneeled down and closed my eyes, my hands lit toward the heavens, I saw Jesus Christ at the right hand of God, looking down upon me, and God the Father looking upon him. We are led to see a unique experience that Joseph saw the Father and the Son. And that was the start of the establishment of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the latter days, and God restoring his kingdom. Now, Joseph, by the time he gets to his 1838 account, goes different to all the other ones we've seen. All the other accounts very much focus on a forgiveness of sins and an identity of perhaps of what the character of God might be like. Joseph goes one further and is told, you're going to establish my church and restore that. And so there is a uniqueness in Joseph's story, but there's also a lot of similarity. Joseph was not unique in a theophany. In fact, there were many, many theophanies that occurred in that worldview around him. Now, did Joseph meet any of these people? You know, certainly some of these were itinerant preachers who were traveling around that New England area at the time Joseph was living there as a young lad. So he might have done. Did Joseph read the accounts of these people? I've no idea. Okay, I have no way of knowing that. But certainly those accounts did exist. And certainly these were the kind of things that would have been part of the narrative, part of the conversation in that world at that time. These stories and stories like them would have been familiar to Joseph. And for him to be able to talk about his own theophany would not have been so far away from experiences other people had claimed at the time. And there is a strong possibility that he either met, interacted with, or at least was aware of some of these other stories and theophanies that existed. He could easily have a source for the inspiration for a first vision. Let's put it that way. So what is the truth? It's hard to say. The accounts of the first vision are inconsistent, and that's a fact. Okay, we've looked at the accounts that are there. There are some consistencies that go through them, but the actual accounts are inconsistent in what they do. These accounts do show a progression in LDS theology. Okay, so we start off, and if we look at LDS theology over those early years of the church, we start off with the idea of the church, of the belief that God, the Father, was a personage of spirit, that Jesus may have had a body, and we gradually, the worldview changes and Joseph's view changes, and by the time we get to the 1840s, we're talking about God the Father and the Son both being physical beings. Now, if we look at the stories being told, all right, 1832, I think I saw the Son, although he doesn't, I saw the Lord. That fits with the worldview at the time of what he's teaching in 1834, of the Father having a spirit, Jesus Christ being physical. 1835 account doesn't name who he saw. Okay, 1838 we see we see the story that we know and are familiar with, and we have this evolving theology that comes through. So the accounts do show a progression in LDS theology. However, the official account is not congruent with Joseph's own teachings. In 1820, he claims to have seen the Father and the Son, and then 12 to 14 years later, he's teaching that the Father, who he says he's seen, is a personage of spirit. It's actually a really little thing, but a really, really important little thing. These contradictory accounts were consistent enough for Joseph Fielding Smith to decide he needed to hide them. Joseph's theophany was not unique and matched the experience of many others in his spiritual world. Early missionaries did not teach the first vision. They focused on the visit of Moroni in 1823 and the Priest of Restoration itself. So what is the truth? I don't know. All right. I know what I think, and I go with where the data directs me. Okay. And that directs me to have massive questions about what actually happened and whether a first vision occurred. But what is the truth? The truth I don't know. What I would say is the likelihood is something happened, but exactly what is very unclear. And accepting the official narrative the church has is purely a matter of faith with very little evidence. When we consider the idea of flashbulb memories and the passage of memory over the time, and we consider a worldview where theophany is happening, and we have a 14-year-old lad living in a world of religious revival, I can get my head around and picture the idea of a 14-year-old kid turned around, concerned for his family, for himself, for his soul, and going and finding a quiet place to pray. And I can get my head around that he had some sort of spiritual experience at that time. What that spiritual experience was, I don't know. All right. And could that spiritual experience and his memory have evolved and grown over the time? Absolutely. Does it lend strength to the truth claims of the church? No. But those truth claims are, as we've already said, are a matter of faith. So the first vision then, it's a fascinating topic, rich in spiritual history and historical significance. Its variations, memory dynamics and culture context invite us to reflect deeply on this. So here are my questions to you. At the end of every each of these podcasts, I'm asking a few questions. I'd be really interested to get your thoughts in the comments there. What I want to know is, what do these differences tell us about Joseph's experience? How do we balance faith and critical analysis to understand sacred history? And most importantly, what do you think about the first vision and its variations? How do you square these different variations in terms of your faith or lack of? And what is that impact on you? Next week, we're going to be looking at Doctrine and Covenants section 2 and Joseph Smith History 1:27-65. And the lesson is called The Hearts of the Children Shall Turn to Their Fathers. You can be sure we'll be looking at Elijah as part of this discussion. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with you today. It's nice to see there's at least a few people still in the chat with me. If you've stuck here this long, you probably deserve a medal. Thank you very much for being with me. If you stuck here this long, can I get you just to look down at the bottom of your screen below where you're on YouTube and find that button that says like and hit it. And then move along and find the one that says subscribe and hit that as well, so that you get informed about future podcasts. Those likes and those subscribes are vital to me to be able to get the message that I'm trying to share out and grow this podcast. So if you feel that you can do that, please do. Just another shout out, actually, since I'm doing this live, at 8 o'clock tonight, 21st Century Saints. Tell me if I've got this wrong. 8 o'clock tonight, 21st Century Saints are on with Nemo on his podcast, where they're going to be exploring safeguarding and child protection issues in the church on the back of the publication that the 21st Century Saints team have released earlier this week. It looks like it's going to be an interesting podcast. If you've an interest in child protection, child safety in the church, I would definitely look at 21st Century Saints, look for Nemo and the Mormon, jump on their channel, 8 o'clock. It should be an interesting discussion. In the meantime, my name's Beyond Belief. It's been a pleasure to work and talk with you today. I've just got a question 3.
I need to wear my glasses when I do this. Was it teach us to believe Joseph or to know we could get our own enlightenment? Really, really important question, actually. I like that. Thank you very much for that question in the comments there. I think that one of the biggest interesting points, and we discussed this very early in the lesson, actually, when we looked at what the church is teaching today. And that was the idea of personal revelation, going back to the idea, any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. I think that one of the most important pieces that we can get from the first vision, whatever our faith standpoint, whether we believe that Joseph was the man he claimed to be, whether we believe he was a fraud and imposter, whether we have faith in Jesus Christ, or whether we are an agnostic/atheist position, what Joseph did and set an example was going in for himself and sorting it out for himself and seeking his own enlightenment, to use the phrase you put there. And I think that's actually a really important lesson, that whatever our faith standpoint, that we can learn from Joseph and this story, is the idea is that we can go and explore and ask questions, and we don't need somebody else to tell us what faith is. We can figure that out in our own context, in our own lives along the way. Thank you very much for being with us today. Like I said, like, subscribe, come back next week, tell us your comments and your thoughts in the chat. I really want to know what you think on this. I really want to turn these into a dialogue and discussion. My name's Beyond Belief. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with everyone today.